Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Handpicked. I'm Laine Young.
And I'm Charlie Spring.
Today we're really excited to share another episode from the Voicing Change project. What are we talking about today, Charlie?
So this is part 2 of our Forests, Food and People episodes, featuring discussion between our team members in Brazil, Kenya and Canada.
Well, I can't wait to hear it.
Well, let's get to it then.
Pegodita Kodiriwi.
Ma en lando para manhã de opus.
Este é mudança de voz.
Welcome to the Voicing Change podcast. I'm Charlie Spring, your host for today. In our previous episode exploring relationships between forests, food and people, we heard people from Brazil, Kenya and Canada telling us about some of the features of the forests in their respective regions and how people have used and cared for those forests for survival for millennia. We heard how in the Northwest Territories of Canada, wildfire has been a key agent of forest control, whereas in Kenya and Brazil, forests have long been managed by governments in the service of colonial regimes. However, in all of these regions, Indigenous people and forest residents have deep knowledge about the forest and the non-humans that live there, including medicinal plants, native and introduced animal species, and the unique bioregions made up of particular tree ecologies. Fundamentally, we learned how the forest is far more than a resource to be owned and plundered, but that forests are an integral part of the way humans see themselves and our interrelationships with our environments. In this second part of our forest-themed podcast episodes, we'll turn to consider threats to these vital and ancient human-forest relationships. We consider the role of a fast-changing climate, including wildfire and drought, and human interventions such as deforestation. But we also shed light on resistance to these threats by people who are fighting to protect our forest commons. So in this episode, you will hear Eve Nimmo interviewing forest ecologist Jen Baltzer, who discusses the Northwest Territories in Canada. Also Zach Ngalo on the forests around Migori County in Kenya, and Andre Lacerda on the Araucaria forests of Paraná, Brazil. First off, Eve asked Jen about the biggest problems facing the communities that rely on forests in northern Canada.
The main and most pressing issue that communities in the Northwest Territories are facing are the direct threats from climate warming. High latitudes, and the Northwest Territories included, have warmed faster than any other place on the planet. So we've seen about a 4 degrees Celsius increase in annual average temperatures in northern parts of Canada over the last 50 years. This is leading to tremendous changes in the way the entire system operates. So it's, having direct impacts of warming. So leading to, declines in some places in forests, leading to changes in species ranges that have various concerns for communities and land managers. And there are the indirect effects of climate warming. Well, some additional direct effects of climate warming are, changes in snow and ice cover. So lengthening of the growing season, shortening of the winter season, which then has implications for other important components of this system. So specifically the existence of permafrost and the nature of wildfires in the system. And so this rapid warming that we're seeing is driving widespread thaw of permafrost, which, in some places leads to really these, what we refer to as thermokarst or abrupt thaw. And basically the ground surface subsides or slides away. We can see landslides in some places. We see ground subsidence in other places where the land just becomes flooded and the forests are lost. These aspects of changing permafrost conditions impact safety of people on the land as they're moving around, and impact wildlife habitat and impact habitat for other plant species that are important. And so this is one indirect impact of climate change that is having profound consequences for forests in the north. The second piece is wildfires. So as I mentioned, these are a natural and important part of this system, but warming climate without a corresponding increase in precipitation is leading to a drying system, and a drying system means more fuel. In addition to that, we're seeing with climate change, we're seeing increases in lightning strike frequency. So we have both more fuel on the landscape because of these drier conditions and the ignitions to start fires. And so we're seeing, larger area burned, more severe wildfire, more frequent wildfire, and this is altering the nature of the forest. We're seeing widespread compositional change in response to this change in fire activity. We're seeing communities threatened on a regular basis by wildfire because the fires are burning more intensely and are harder to manage by managers. So there's a large number of impacts of climate warming. So it's not a management issue. It's really, that these northern communities are one of these vulnerable groups when we think about climate warming impacts. They're not causing the change, but they are the recipients of a really profound number of consequences of climate warming.
Thanks, Jen. Zach, can you tell us a little bit about the challenges that the communities that you work are facing in terms of how they depend on the forest and how this situation came about?
In other areas where people live close to the national parks, we have similar challenges, but these are from the national parks. But this is agricultural area mainly. Fortunately, we've not had any problems with the wildfires. And I think this is because all around the hill, there's agricultural activities going on, and we have privately owned gardens. So people protect their gardens, and you will not find it easy for wildfires to come in. Previously, there was a practice of burning remains in the fields after harvest, but that has also gone down because currently you find that even the maize stalks that remain after harvest, people collect them and process them and give them to cattle for feeding. So the risk of burning them and then the fire going into the forest has been reduced drastically. One of the challenges is that even for those who want to use the forest for medicinal purposes, sometimes it becomes difficult because somebody seeing you in his private land, which has the medicinal plants, sometimes may just not take it very easy. But if they know that you are only getting the medicinal plants and you're not taking the bark, because some of the plants, you take the bark, and if there's over harvesting of the bark, the plants would dry up. So most of the people would the leaves, but again, you find that a number of them, the active component is more concentrated on the roots and the bark than the leaves.
That's interesting, Zach. And just a follow-up question on that is about access to forests. So it seems that you're saying is that most community members don't have access to forest because it's all on private property. Is that the case?
They will have access, but limited access because it's somebody's property. So if you're going in, people don't move in freely as they used to in the past. In the past, some 30, 40 years ago, you would graze anywhere, you would use any material from any land, even if it was somebody's property. But you see, nowadays, people have title deeds for their parcels of land. And if you have a title deed for that parcel of land, it's like you own it. And if you have something precious in that land, you have to protect it. And in cases where they have not protected well, you find that the medicinal plants have disappeared or have reduced in abundance. So people are taking caution so that we don't lose this diversity of medicinal plants.
Thanks, Zach. That's very interesting to think about access to these traditional resources and how that is a challenge for communities. Andrea, can you tell us a little bit about the challenges that people here face in terms of forest resources and how that came about?
It's interesting to make those comparisons, understand the similarities with other places. In Brazil, also forests are basically in private properties. So despite, unless are protected areas like forest reserves, all the forests are in private properties. But regulations, federal laws require that forest properties need to have at least 20% of its area covered with forests, in which forest management is basically forbidden. So people have a restriction in how they use their own properties. And because of more regulations were enacted recently or in the last decades, what happened is that all forests in private lands are no longer available for forest management. So small farmers that for the longest time, for generations, have protected and managed their forests, nowadays see themselves as forbidden to use those forests. So we have worked with farmers that have 80-90% of their land covered with forests, with little land, not much land to do other activities such as agriculture and other food source production. So farmers in the end see themselves as unfairly affected by those regulations, as we see other parts of the country in which have more desirable and fertile soils. Basically, there's no forest left, and despite these regulations in place. So these small farmers, small scale farmers are very restricted in the ways they use the land, which creates this conflict between government agencies and their regulations and farmers. So it also creates another feeling that the traditional knowledge is basically nullified, because they have been managing this forest for so long, and suddenly a regulation in the environmental agencies come and say, well, you can no longer use the forest as you used to, as your grandparents used to do in the past. So it creates a very huge conflict in the region. So people, they are supposed to protect the forests, and they do sometimes, they feel like they are unfairly treated. And to create this very complex context, it has been created this idea, mainly in urban areas, that really the farmers are the one that deforest all the land. So it's this very complex that people in urban areas thinking that farmers are the ones destroy the nature. In fact, the small-scale farmers are the ones that have been protecting the forests. What they want is to be able to manage, to some extent, the forest as they have been using or have been managing for generations. So it's a very complex situation in which small-scale farmers are really in the disadvantage point.
Thanks, Andre. Jen has already given us a really good idea as to what the impacts of climate change are on the forests in the Northwest Territories. And I'm wondering if, Andre and Zach, if you could give us a little bit of information about how global warming in changes in climate are affecting forest resources, and if there's a movement towards conservation or other kinds of mitigation practices. So, Zach, I'll start with you.
It's very interesting to have these comparisons. I'm always amazed when I hear about the Amazon River Basin because of the diversity of plants that you have there. If we talk of climate change in our area, I think maybe the climate change has not elicited some fear, because when we started talking about climate change, we have seen changes here that the rains have increased. It's no longer easy to predict when the rains are starting and when the rains are stopping. Previously, the farmers would tell you the date when they would plant. And of course, when they plant, it would start raining. But right now, it has, in the past 3 or 4 years, you find that it's raining continuously, or the rains come when you don't expect. Sometimes it even defies the weather forecast, so that when you think it's going to be dry, you find that it's raining in some parts. Although it's different again in some parts of Kenya, where you have had drought for a very long period of time, where you find people are suffering or dying because of drought, animals are dying. Sometimes we rely on the weather forecast, but it's not that accurate because we have surprises from the weather.
Okay, thank you, Zach. Andre, I think it's kind of a similar situation here in southern Brazil. The changes from climate change are starting to have impacts, but they haven't been felt quite as intensely as in the Northwest Territories.
Yes, climate change has been obvious here, but not as obvious in the Northern Territories. But we're starting to see some trends that have been more obvious, mostly in the last 10, 20 years. So what we're observing is that the growing season seems to be longer than the historic records. We used to have the winter season across the season with colder temperatures, and it's no longer happening. What we're seeing is warmer temperatures with cold snaps, which affects obviously the growing season of plants. So agriculture has been suffering quite a bit because plants continue to grow, or people start planting earlier after the winter because temperatures are already warmer. But then we might have those unpredictable late frosts happening and killing the plants. We also have seen more common droughts. In the region here, we basically don't have drought seasons, but we have had for the last decade very long drought seasons, which has affected severely the vegetation, with some species obviously not doing as well as others.
Thanks, Andre. So Jen, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what communities are doing to kind of to address these impacts of climate change. If there's things that you, as a researcher, are working with the community or other institutions, NGOs, or others, what kind of activities are being done to try to address these issues?
Many communities in the North are spending a lot of time and effort focusing on adaptation to climate change. And this takes a lot of different forms. Are there ways that community members can modify how they're moving across the land, how they're using the land to ensure safety when they're out on the land, and also thinking about how to respond when communities know there's, say, a culturally important place that is at risk from permafrost thaw and ground subsidence or landslides or what have you. Thinking about how they want to respond to that. Do they want to try to rescue important things from those places and move them elsewhere, et cetera? There's been a move in the Northwest Territories toward creating these fire breaks around communities. Now, a challenge with that is ensuring that those are maintained. And so communities are making decisions on a community by community basis as to how they're going to maintain these fuel breaks in the landscape to try to buffer their communities from wildfire. And one great example of how that's being handled is planting food crops, planting berry crops that are culturally important. So planting culturally appropriate food resources into these forest breaks to maintain that fuel break on the landscape, while also providing access to resources that are important to the community. And so those are a couple of examples of how communities are responding to these changes. I think community-based monitoring is one of the things that we're seeing in the kind of the most widespread way across the North. There's the Indigenous Guardians program, where these guardians are trained in both, traditional knowledge. They learn the local and traditional knowledge of the land. They become, really important knowledge holders in the community, while also working with Western scientists on some of the monitoring approaches that we use to quantify change. And so sort of taking a two ways of knowing approach and braiding these knowledge systems to best monitor and understand the changes that are happening and be able to prepare to respond to these changes, at least for their region, have the evidence that they need to say, okay, we need support in these ways because changes are happening in these ways for aspects of the land or water that's important to us. And so probably that's the most common response we're seeing across the North is increased Indigenous stewardship of the land, increased Indigenous-led monitoring of the land to try to evaluate these impacts and understand what they mean for communities.
Thanks, Jen. That's really interesting that there's such a focus on valuing the impacts that these, or how communities are feeling these impacts. And it's not just, scientific monitoring about numbers and how things are changing, but what that impact has for the people, for the resources that are important to them in the communities. Andre, can you tell us a little bit about some of the strategies that people are using here in southern Brazil to kind of mitigate against future shocks, climate shocks, or other issues with climate, or also forest degradation in deforestation?
The initiatives here in southern Brazil are basically grassroots initiatives in which people are discussing and seeing as alternatives to climate change agroforestry and agroecological systems as a way to buffer these changes. But those ones are carried out by NGOs and communities and universities. So they are very grassroots. But when you move to, let's say, higher levels like governments, the discussion is very much like scientific, let's say. So we are like monitoring, we are planning what strategies should be done, but there is this top-down difficulty of how to make it happen in the field. So there's this big disconnection between national strategies and how to implement them. And so basically no support for people and for institutions like in the field. So it's basically just grassroots, and farmers are seeing themselves affected by, or like victims of this climate change, but they don't know exactly what to do with that. So because they see that the growing season is changing, they see that the rain is unpredictable now, and they don't know exactly what to do. So I think it's mostly something that communities with help of other institutions in a grassroots movement that is trying to find themselves solutions for that. And mostly this, again, it's done by farmers that see agroforestry and agroecology as a solution for those challenges that we are starting to see more obviously. But I see still this disconnection between the government level initiatives and what is going on in the field. This should really be addressed as soon as possible.
Zach, did you want to give us some indication as to the kinds of strategies that are being put in place in your region in Kenya to deal with changes to the changing climate or deforestation?
I can say that one of the things that farmers are doing, or I would advise farmers to do, is to grow more of indigenous crops that are drought tolerant. So in preparation for any challenges of climate change, we have to look at the type of trees that we entertain in the regions that are prone to devastation when you have climate change, especially if you have long periods of drought. But again, we talk of conservation and utilization. So if you find that we will use a lot of timber for firewood, then we would encourage people also to grow this in advance so that when they reduce in abundance, we will still have enough to cater for our fuel needs. Because if we look at the cost of living, cost of petrol, it's going up so high that some people may not manage to afford that, but they would depend on the natural resources like forests to get firewood, to get sometimes even what they eat. We have berries, we have nuts, we have fruits that are found in the forests. So I would say that in preparation for climate change in most parts of Kenya, we would actually advocate for indigenous crops that are drought resistant. One other thing that we have realized with the climate change is reinfestation by vectors of disease. At the moment, we have a lot of mosquitoes. And we even find mosquitoes crossing into areas like parts of the Rift Valley where there was no malaria, there were no mosquitoes. But now, because of the human activities, we are finding that we are having a lot of public health challenges that were not there before that are cropping in at the moment.
Thanks, Zach. That's very interesting that the impacts of climate change go much further than just the forests, the food, and the people. It goes to all aspects of life.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Voicing Change. In our next episode, we'll introduce agroecology, which is one of the guiding themes and sources of inspiration for the Voicing Change project. Editing and sound design for this episode is by Narayan Subramoniam. Our music is composed by Ali Razmi. Voicing Change is produced with support from the Laurier Centre for Sustainable Food Systems, Wilfrid Laurier University, the Centre for International Governance Innovation, and the Baltzer School of International Affairs.